Hey guys, I'm Ian McCollum. I run ForgottenWeapons.com and the Forgotten Weapons YouTube channel, which is a video channel dedicated to presenting the history and the mechanics of interesting and unusual firearms. Boom! As well as occasionally common and standard firearms, like the AK and its various iterations. So today, IGN has asked me to take a look at video clips of a selection of AKs used in a selection of video games, and comment on how accurate, how realistic they are. All right, so I feel like the rate of fire is a little bit slower than on a real AK. The big thing, obviously, in the model is that there's no rear sight on the gun, but you kind of have to give that to a game like this that's old enough that it's not like they were actually able to properly render a photorealistic, well, anything. The reloads are also totally unrealistically fast, but that's sort of a given for a game like this. They never incorporate the actual time that it takes to do things, or anything like a malfunction, because that would just make the game less fun. There's not that much that actually differentiates any of the guns in a way that's relevant to the real version of the gun. You shoot stuff, and different guns have theoretically a different rate of fire and do different amounts of damage. But beyond that, the actual mechanics and functioning of the gun have no implication in the game. So it's not like you can look at this and go, well, the AK has slow reloads or fast reloads compared to something else, because the game treats everything the same. But again, we're talking about, this is 1997. They weren't photorealistically rendering anything in here. AK versus KF7. There's a lot of potential liability, or perceived potential liability, among video game producers for using actual real names of things. I know there's been some legal action. The last I heard was like legal action involving Hummer and GM, and I think one of the Call of Duty games. But it obviously, as you see here, it goes back a long time. So they looked at the name, putting the actual name and model designation of a real firearm, and their lawyers probably freaked out and told them they had to change it. And so they change it to something. Many, many years later, looking at people talking about games actually like GoldenEye that I did play a little bit back in high school, and looking at things like the Clob and going, oh right, that's actually a VZ61 Scorpion, but they changed the name for what was at the time some imperceivable reason. But yeah, I think it's just misplaced liability concern. So now we've gotten to a game where there actually is enough processing power, it looks like 2008, to mostly render a gun. The rear sight on here is wrong, just go with wrong. This should have a very narrow aperture, and I think what they have done, which is kind of interesting, is they've modeled the rear sight so that when you look at it on the computer screen, you actually see it the same way that in real life you see the sight when you look down the sights of an AK. So that rear sight notch in reality is only about 2 millimeters wide, but because of your head's relative position to it, it looks wider when you're using the gun. And I think the way they've modeled this allows the front and the rear sight to look correct relative to each other. Nope, not really. When you look down the sights here in the game, you see the entire front sight and its wings in that rear sight. You should just see the front post. One of the potential problems with front sight protectors like this thing has is that occasionally, if you're not paying attention, you can actually pick up one of the front sight wings and think that it's the front post and try to use that as your front sight. And then of course you shoot far off to one side. They have also mirror imaged the gun here. It's all backwards. The charging handle is actually on the right side. Conveniently, I have an AK to show you. In the game, charging handle's over here. In reality, it's on the right side. So is the safety. They've put a couple of rivets on the back of the dust cover, which aren't actually there in reality. Holy cow, they actually put a malfunction in. That's unusual and kind of cool. At the same time, they have also put rivets on the front and the back of the gun. However, they have also put the scalloped lightning cut in the side of the receiver, which indicates that it is actually a milled receiver. There are two types of AKs out there. The original AKs use a solid block of steel milled into a receiver. That type will have a lightning cut here, because there was just more metal than they really needed. In 59, when they went to the AKM modernized platform, that was replaced by a stamped sheet metal receiver. The sheet metal receiver has front and rear trunnions riveted into it, so you will get either a lightning cut or rivets. You will never have both, and they've gone all in and put both on this model. All right, so they showed the gun exploding, which is an interesting addition that I'm not used to seeing in games. What's more likely to happen on an AK is if you have some sort of significant malfunction, like an out of battery detonation, like the cartridge detonates before it's fully locked in the chamber, it will send the bolt back at too high of a velocity. The bolt will then slam into the rear of the gun, and that dust cover on top, right here, is only kind of held on by some spring tension and the recoil spring plug, and a significant blow can in fact throw the dust cover off, which is what they modeled. Exactly what the mechanism is that caused the gun in the game to explode, I'm a little curious about. That doesn't just happen, but I have not played Far Cry 2. Actually, I haven't played any of the Far Cry games, so I'm not sure what the mechanism is there. All right, our intrepid hero has replaced his functional AK for a gold AK with no shoulder stock, that's a bold move, Cotton. Let's see how that goes for him. All right, well, it's gonna go just fine for him because the game doesn't have any sort of modeling to involve putting the rifle on the shoulder instead of just holding out in front of you and waving it around. Your ability to hold a rifle or pistol on target without it moving around is greatly exaggerated in video games compared to real life.
How beneficial would it be to remove the stock from a gold AK? Do you think it was done for weight reasons or just to make it look a bit more cool?
Oh, it's done to make it look cool by someone who hasn't a clue what they're doing with it. That is the only reason. That's really the only reason anybody owns a gold firearm of any kind, is because it looks cool if you don't really know what makes a gun useful. You do see people taking the stocks off of AKs in combat zones from time to time. The only practical advantage to that is it makes the gun smaller if you have to conceal it, or if, frankly, you're going to carry it a lot, shoot it a little bit, and not really care about whether you actually hit anything. Then, by all means, take the stock off, because why not? Okay, so what's going on here is this isn't actually an AK. This model is an amalgamation of a number of Soviet firearms. We have mostly a magazine from an AK, but we have the top cover from a PKM or PK. We have a handguard in the front that is pretty much off of an RPD light machine gun. I do know a bit about Fallout, and the Fallout post-apocalyptic universe is the sort of thing where you would have a lot of cobbled together stuff. Now, could you actually cobble this gun together? I'm gonna go with no at this point, but let me watch a little bit more and see if I can get a better view of it. I'm curious if the number of cartridge casings that come out of the gun is actually matched to the number of rounds that are fired, because they're definitely coming out of that rifle faster than they really would. They would be spaced out farther apart than that. And they're coming out faster than the audio rate of fire would indicate. Ah, there we go, there's a good side view. Yeah, I'm pretty much gonna stick with the assessment that I've made up to this point. Clearly the designers took some artistic liberty and had some fun coming up with this model, and I would expect all the other models in the game. I would say, as an enthusiast of very odd firearms, I would be all over owning this, and absolutely I'd go out and shoot it too, as long as I knew it was put together reasonably well. Ugly Frankengun sounds like a perfect description. This is a standard AKM pattern. So it's got the stamped receiver. You can see the rivets, they're properly done. This one has been set up with an optics mounting rail on the left side, which looks accurate and appropriately done. Frankly, pretty much all the details on this look pretty darn good. And they've got the rear sight set to probably 300 meters, which is a little bit, So I'll go back to my grungy AKM example here. So that's the rear sight. In the game, you can see that this rear sight slider is several notches down the rear sight. And if I match approximately what they've got, that's 500 meters setting, which if I remember from seeing other people play Counter-Strike, there's no 500 meter shots in this game. So this would be leading you to shoot relatively high. But if that's the worst that they do, well, that's pretty good. So let's watch him actually put it into use. All right. two of my own pet peeves about video games here. First off, even when you're looking at someone in a third-person perspective, they're not shouldering the rifles here. They're just holding them at the hip and waving them around shooting. And yet you get this nice dot on the screen that tells you exactly where you're aiming, which is not how reality works. It takes a tremendous amount of practice to be able to fire a rifle accurately from the hip. And frankly, very few people can actually pull it off. There's a reason that the sights are there, you can use them and then you can actually aim at what you're trying to hit. My other pet peeve, of course, is the amount of physical damage that guns do in a lot of games like this. The reality is one shot from an AK will most likely incapacitate anyone, and 2 or 3 will almost certainly kill them. And in Counter-Strike in particular, you've got this gun set to do, I don't know exactly what, but essentially trivial amount of damage, where you saw this guy dumping like an entire magazine into a bad guy who just stood there sucking up bullets. Because if you made the guns realistically lethal, it would completely change the gameplay dynamics, where you couldn't just run around gung-ho spraying gunfire because one good shot and you're out. That always kind of rubs me the wrong way. Like, if you're gonna put a gun in a video game, at least make it realistically effective. If you've got 2 AKs that are firing the same caliber and have the same barrel length within a couple of inches, they're gonna handle essentially identically. The stock may impact some of the handling. Particularly poor stock is gonna make the gun a little more difficult to control. As for changing between major patterns of rifles, going from ARs to AKs, that sort of thing, largely what's going to make a difference is the cartridge that the gun is firing. After that, things get a lot more subtle. The characteristics of the trigger are going to affect your ability to shoot them well, and then stock and to a lesser extent handguard sort of impact controllability. So that's Counter-Strike. Essentially, the graphics team did the modeling really well. The gameplay team did not really consider realism as particularly relevant to the game, which seems to be how a lot of modern shooters are set up. Looks good, sounds pretty good, but it doesn't play like any sort of actual gunfight. Okay, Call of Duty is another one I have never played, and I don't know anything about Warzone, so let's dig in and find out. It's Bruce Willis.
Yippee-ki-yay, mother.
All right, they've once again exaggerated the opening on the rear sight. Otherwise, the model looks pretty good. Looks like we've got a milled receiver here on this one with an optics mount riveted onto it, which is not quite right. By the way, the optics mounts on AKs originally were there primarily for night vision optics, because these are guns that were put into service well before the sort of modern universal issue of optical sights that we have today. So typically it was a limited subset of AKs that would be issued with an optics rail, and it was there specifically for one of these really early 1st or 2nd generation infrared scopes, typically the sort of thing that required an infrared floodlight to go along with it. I'm having a hard time discerning exactly what the health bar sort of status is here, but it does seem like guys take an awful lot of hits to actually go down. The thing is, if you're wearing solid body armor and you get hit in the body armor, it doesn't hurt you. It may jostle you, it'll certainly get your attention, and it might hurt, might not, depending on the cartridge and the type of body armor. But the way games, at least in my understanding and experience, work is when you get the armor, you essentially have more health bar. And so you have to get hit more times. But when you get hit, it still knocks your health bar down. Well, in reality, what that system ought to be is 0, 0, 0, oh, you got shot in the neck and now you're dead. Huh. They actually went so far on the model as to put in a serial number, and it looks like a 1955 production date, which theoretically would be appropriate for a milled receiver gun. That said, not a whole lot else is jumping out to me. All right, this blue thing is actually an AKM. Yep, they've gone to stamped receiver. I'll leave the stickers to a cultural analyst. I think it perhaps has bled over a little bit into real life, but then again, we had fancy gold and silver plated guns for as long as there have been guns. You can look at some of the surviving wheel locks from the 1600s, and you'll find basically the 1600s equivalent of that AK, with all sorts of fancy mythological engravings and gold inlay, and people who have the time and the money to do something like that have been doing it forever in human history. The idea that you could hold a sight picture while firing in full auto is dubious to me. Typically, I mean, that maybe you can, but it takes an awful lot of practice to pull that off. So they've modeled a guy doing a fancy reload here where he grabs his new magazine first and then uses it to hit the magazine release and knock the old mag out. That is something that fancy high-speed people, at least on the internet, like to show off doing. It is absolutely a system that works. I don't know that I'd call it standard practice for a whole lot of people. I would say this looks to me like it kind of also falls into the category of beautifully modeled, but then the gameplay design team recognizes that a gun in a game is ultimately just a collection of numbers. And so they set the numbers to do what they want to make the game balance correctly without any particular relevance to the original gun itself. We had that one example where they actually had malfunctions built into the game, and there's none of that here. Once again, the magazine changes are far too fast to be realistic. They've got it modeled correctly, but the way that the speed that they have that new magazine appearing is like somebody's just holding it there for you. And so all you have to do is like grab the magazine that's just hanging in space and it's in. And that's, again, not exactly how things work. If you watch anyone trying to use actual magazine carrying gear, typically those sorts of pouches are going to have flaps that are secured because it's more important that your magazines not fall out all the time, and that if you have to dive into dirt or mud, that your magazines don't immediately become filled with dirt or mud. The magazine pouch is there to protect them, and that means it's necessary to have some sort of closure, and it's going to take you some time to open up that closure. I think if you want to see an accurate one, you should go play Verdun. That's one where if you want to get shot twice, it better be a pistol, because if someone hits you with a rifle, that's it. It can be very frustrating. It can be very random, and that's how, in this case, World War I really actually was. Beyond that, I think you have a system set up in a lot of these games that is an interesting set of aesthetics and customization and collecting of features, and I understand why that's fun. What we have is a weird situation where that's interposed over allegedly a reality of actual firearms. And there actually isn't any comparison there, really. What people are associating with actual guns are, of course, just collections of digital bits. And any similarity to real firearms is entirely aesthetic and coincidental, basically. And the stuff that people take away from video games with guns is often completely unrelated to the reality of actual physical firearms. I hope there are a lot of people who will get their inspiration for an interest in real firearms and real history from playing games built around digital firearms and made-up scenarios. I hope that's the case. There are certainly some people who play the video games and that's as far as it goes, and then they perpetuate myths, perhaps, from the games. But hopefully we can get a bit beyond that. It was fun to get a chance to see what all the kids are doing these days.
For more expert reacts like this one, why not watch historical weapons expert Matt Easton reacting to Hellish Cart?